I want you to hear something from me before you decide that weak legs are simply what happens after 70. Because I believe that too, and believing it nearly cost me the freedom I valued most. I am 101 years old now, and there was a time when I quietly wondered whether I would soon need someone beside me every time I stood up, walked outside, or climbed 3 little steps into my own kitchen. What frightened me most was not growing older. It was becoming afraid of my own body. I had begun reaching for furniture before I truly needed it, slowing down before every turn, and thinking twice before stepping over the smallest change in the floor. I did not know then that this kind of fear could change the way a person moves, but I learned it slowly, through my own experience. And one sentence from a rehabilitation specialist finally made me look at my legs differently. She told me, "Your legs may not be as helpless as the way you are using them." I was offended at first because I thought I was already being careful. Then I realized that careful had become frightened. I had spent years protecting myself from falling, and without noticing, I had stopped practicing the movements that helped me feel steady. That was the beginning of a completely different chapter for me. I did not buy a machine, join an expensive gym, or start some exhausting program designed for a 25-year-old. I began with movements that looked almost too ordinary to matter. The first one involved a chair. The second involved simply rising onto my toes. The third frightened me more than either of those because it asked me to trust one leg at a time. At first, I thought these movements were too simple to change anything important. Then something happened that I still remember clearly. One morning, I stood up from my chair without preparing myself first. I simply stood. No pushing with my hands, no little pause to gather courage, no thought that I might fail. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like getting a small room of my life back. And that was when I began wondering something I had never asked before. If such a tiny movement could change how I felt about standing, what else had I been capable of all those years without realizing it? The answer took me much longer to understand, and it began with the story of how my legs became afraid in the first place. When I was 77, I still considered myself reasonably active, but I had started noticing little humiliations that I did not tell my children about. I would stand at the bottom of the stairs and calculate them. I would look at a low chair and wonder whether I would need to push myself up with both hands. I began avoiding uneven sidewalks because I disliked the sensation of my ankle wobbling underneath me. I even remember carrying groceries one day and stopping halfway from the car because my legs felt tired in a way that embarrassed me. I told myself I was simply getting older. That sentence is easy to say because it sounds sensible, but sometimes it becomes a hiding place. I had friends from many different places over the years, and I noticed something curious among the older women and men who remained independent. They were not all thin. They did not all eat the same food. Some loved gardening, some loved walking, some preferred sitting on the porch, and some had never set foot in a gym. But many of them had one thing in common. They continued using their bodies for ordinary life. One neighbor in Asheville, Margaret, was nearly 85 when I first noticed how easily she rose from a dining chair. She would stand, turn, walk outside, carry a basket, and return without making any ceremony about it. I asked her what she did for exercise. She laughed and said, "I don't exercise much, honey. I just don't let myself become afraid of moving." That sentence stayed with me. Years later, I met Sarah Collins, a rehabilitation specialist who had spent decades helping older adults regain everyday movement. She did not tell me I needed to become athletic. She explained that the body needs practice not only for strength, but also for timing, balance, and confidence. She helped me understand why walking alone had not solved my problem. Walking was wonderful, and I still loved it. But predictable walking did not challenge every little correction my body needed when I turned, stepped sideways, rose from a chair, or shifted my weight. She showed me how ordinary movements could become gentle practice. Then she said something that changed my thinking again. You do not have to prove anything. You only have to give your body a safe chance to remember. I went home that afternoon with no grand plan. I simply stood beside my kitchen chair and wondered what would happen if I practiced that idea every day. I did not know then that the first exercise would reveal a weakness I had been hiding from myself, while the second would teach my ankles something I had forgotten, and the third would challenge the fear that had quietly been directing my whole walk. The first movement I learned to trust was sitting down and standing back up from a sturdy chair. And I know that sounds almost laughably ordinary until you have reached the point where a chair becomes something you negotiate with instead of something you simply use. I chose a firm chair that did not slide, placed my feet flat on the floor, moved closer to the edge, leaned my chest slightly forward, and pressed through my feet to stand. I did not force myself to do many repetitions. In the beginning, 5 good movements were enough for me, and sometimes I used my fingertips for support because I valued safety more than pride. Then I lowered myself slowly because I wanted to control the return instead of dropping into the seat. What surprised me was how much of daily life appeared inside that one movement. Standing from the toilet, getting out of the car, rising from the kitchen table, leaving a restaurant booth, getting up from bed after sitting for a moment. All of those things became less dramatic as the movement became familiar. I began to understand something important. Independence is often built from tiny abilities that nobody notices until they disappear. The second movement was heel raises, and I almost ignored it because I thought strong legs meant strong thighs. Sarah explained that my calves and ankles also played an important role in walking and balance. So I stood behind the kitchen counter with my fingertips resting lightly on it, rose onto the balls of my feet, paused briefly, and lowered myself slowly. At first, I did 10. Later, I did more when it felt comfortable. I never treated the number as a test of my worth. I treated it as practice. Over time, I noticed that standing in the kitchen became easier. My first steps in the morning felt less stiff, and walking over grass did not make me quite as nervous. Then came the third movement, the one that frightened me most. Gently shifting my weight onto one leg while keeping a hand near something stable. I did not close my eyes. I did not stand on a chair or attempt anything dramatic. I simply moved most of my weight toward one side, lifted the other foot slightly, held for a few seconds, and returned both feet to the floor. The first time, I lasted only 3 seconds. I was embarrassed until Sarah reminded me that 3 honest seconds were better than pretending I could do 20. Gradually, I became steadier. I learned that walking itself requires us to spend little moments on one leg, and practicing that shift in a controlled setting helped me become less startled by ordinary movement. But there was another discovery waiting for me, because I began to notice that my biggest enemy was not always weakness. Sometimes it was the story I had been telling my body for years. I used to think that being careful was always the same thing as being safe, but my experience taught me that there is a difference between sensible caution and living as though every step is a possible disaster. After one small stumble in my 70s, I began walking with shorter steps. I kept my knees stiff. I reached for furniture. I turned slowly, even when I did not need to. I watched the ground more than I watched where I was going. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was also practicing hesitation every day. Sarah noticed it before I did. She asked me to stand normally and then asked me to walk across the room. She said my body looked as though it was waiting for something bad to happen. That sentence stayed with me because I realized she was right. My legs were not only carrying me, they were responding to my expectations. I had become so worried about falling that I had forgotten what confident movement felt like. This does not mean fear is imaginary. A fall can be serious, especially later in life, and I would never tell someone to ignore pain, dizziness, sudden weakness, numbness, unusual swelling, or a new problem with walking. Those are reasons to speak with a qualified healthcare professional rather than guessing from a video. What I am talking about is the slow change that can happen when someone gradually stops challenging ordinary movement because they are afraid. I saw it in friends, relatives, and neighbors. One woman I knew stopped going into her garden because the ground was uneven. Another began eating meals in a recliner because the dining chair felt difficult to rise from. A man down the street stopped carrying his own small grocery bag because he feared losing balance. None of them woke up one morning and decided to give up independence. It happened through dozens of tiny decisions. That realization changed the way I practiced. Before sitting down, I reminded myself to move forward and rise. Before heel raises, I thought about gently pushing the floor away. Before balance practice, I thought about arriving over my standing leg rather than falling onto it. These were not magical words. They simply gave my attention something useful to do. I stopped speaking to myself as though I were fragile. I also stopped demanding that my body perform like it had at 40. My goal became steadiness, not youth. That distinction gave me peace. Then, after several weeks, I noticed something I had not expected. My exercises were beginning to follow me outside the kitchen. I was using the same calm movement when I climbed stairs, stepped off curbs, stood at the sink, and walked across the yard. That was when I realized the real question was not whether 3 exercises could make me young again. The real question was whether they could help me keep doing the ordinary things that made my life feel like mine. As the months passed, I began noticing changes that had nothing to do with looking younger. I could stand at the kitchen counter longer while preparing vegetables. I could get out of the car after a long ride without sitting there collecting courage. I could carry a small bag from the market and think about what I was going to cook instead of thinking about whether my legs would cooperate. Stairs still required respect, but they no longer felt like a negotiation with an enemy. I also began paying attention to what I ate because movement and food had always been connected in my mind. I was never interested in extreme diets. My mother taught me to eat ordinary food, and after more than a century of watching people, I still believe there is something valuable about meals built around vegetables, fruit, beans, lentils, eggs, yogurt, nuts, fish when it suits the person, and enough water for individual needs. I especially noticed that active older people I knew tended to keep their meals simple rather than chasing miracle ingredients. One friend ate beans and greens several times a week. Another kept apples and berries on the counter instead of sweets. I had another friend who loved lentil soup and said it was easier to prepare than anything from a package. These foods are not magic, and I would never tell someone that a particular fruit or vegetable can prevent, reverse, or cure a medical condition. I simply noticed that real food, regular meals, and enough nourishment made more sense to me than constantly searching for a miracle. The same was true for exercise. I did not need 20 movements. I needed a few movements I could remember and repeat. Some mornings I practiced sit to stand before breakfast. Later, while waiting for water to boil, I did heel raises. When I was near the kitchen counter, I practiced gentle weight shifts and brief single leg stands. I kept the support nearby because being independent does not mean refusing support. It means using support intelligently while you build confidence. That distinction matters enormously. I also kept walking because I loved walking. I walked through my neighborhood in Asheville and paid attention to the trees, the weather, the people waving from porches, and the little changes that make a familiar street feel alive. I did not walk to punish myself or earn food. I walked because I wanted somewhere to go. That may sound like a small difference, but purpose changes movement. When you have a reason to get up, the body has a reason to participate. My garden gave me another reason. My family gave me another. A neighbor who needed a conversation gave me another. And slowly I understood something I wish I had known at 70. Healthy aging is not one perfect habit. It is a collection of ordinary choices that keep life open. But I still had one final lesson to learn, because even after my legs became stronger, there was one habit that could easily have taken my confidence away again. That habit was rushing, and I did not recognize it because I thought moving quickly meant being capable. If the phone rang, I hurried. If water was boiling, I hurried. If I stood up, I wanted to get moving immediately. But rushing changed my balance. My feet landed without attention. My weight shifted before I was ready, and I sometimes held my breath without realizing it. Sarah told me that moving deliberately did not mean moving slowly forever. It meant giving myself enough time to organize the movement. So I began practicing three simple ideas in ordinary life. I would sit and stand with control. I would rise through my feet instead of pulling myself forward with my hands. I would pause before changing direction. These small habits made the exercises feel less like exercise and more like rehearsal for life. I also learned not to compare one side of my body with the other. My left leg was more confident than my right, and I used to become annoyed when the right side trembled. Then I changed the way I interpreted that trembling. Instead of calling it failure, I called it information. My body was showing me where I needed more practice. I gave that side time rather than punishment. That was one of the most useful lessons I learned in my 90s. Older bodies do not always need more force. Sometimes they need more patience. I also stopped believing that every improvement had to be dramatic. The first victory was standing up without thinking about it. The next was carrying groceries. Then came walking across the grass. Then standing at the sink longer. Then turning around without reaching for the counter. None of these moments would impress a fitness instructor, but each one meant something enormous to me, because each one represented a little more freedom. I began keeping a mental record of ordinary things I could still do. I could make my breakfast. I could water my plants. I could walk to the mailbox. I could visit a neighbor. I could climb my stairs carefully. I could sit down and stand back up. Those abilities became my definition of strength. Not how much weight I could lift, but how much of my own life I could still participate in. If you are listening to me now and thinking, I am too old to begin, I understand, because I once said the same thing. But beginning does not have to mean doing everything. It can mean standing beside a sturdy chair and asking what your body can comfortably do today. It can mean practicing one movement with support. It can mean asking a physical therapist or healthcare professional what is appropriate for you if you have a medical condition, recent surgery, significant pain, or a history of falls. There is no shame in getting guidance. In fact, I wish more people did it sooner. And there is one final part of my story that matters even more than the exercises themselves, because strength without a reason to use it never felt like the whole answer to me. Now I am 101, and when I look back at the frightened woman I was at 77, I feel tenderness for her rather than disappointment. She was not weak. She was scared. She had seen people lose their independence and assumed the same story was waiting for her. What changed my life was not one miracle exercise and certainly not a promise that aging could be reversed. What changed my life was discovering that I could still participate in my own future. The chair taught me to rise. The heel raises taught me to trust my feet and ankles. The gentle single leg balance taught me that shifting my weight did not have to mean losing control. Together, these movements gave me something I had been slowly giving away: confidence. I still use a handrail when I need one. I still hold the counter when I practice balance. I still have mornings when my joints feel older than I would prefer. I do not pretend otherwise. Being 101 has not turned me into a woman made of steel. It has simply taught me that strength can coexist with tenderness. I also learned that food, sleep, walking, sunlight, friendship, purpose, and movement belong to the same larger picture. I like vegetables because they are simple. I like fruit because it makes an ordinary meal feel generous. I like beans and lentils because they remind me that healthy food does not have to be expensive. I like walking because it gives me somewhere to go. And I love these three exercises because they remind my body again and again that standing, pushing, rising, and balancing are movements worth practicing. If you are over 70, please do not measure your future by what your legs could do 20 years ago. Measure it by what they can learn now. Maybe you can stand 5 times. Maybe you need your hands. Maybe you can rise onto your toes only a little. Maybe 3 seconds on one leg is all you have today. That is not a reason to be ashamed. That is your starting point. And if your body gives you a warning through sudden weakness, severe pain, dizziness, numbness, unusual swelling, chest symptoms, or a new major change in your ability to walk, please do not try to push through it because I said so. Get appropriate medical advice. I am an old woman sharing what I observed in my own life, not a doctor giving you treatment. What I can tell you is this. I once feared that my world was becoming smaller, and little by little I learned to open it again. At 101, I still have places I want to walk, meals I want to cook, people I want to call, trees I want to see bloom, and mornings I am grateful to receive. If these words gave you even a little hope, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. We will keep discovering simple, sensible ways to care for the body we still have, because getting older does not mean your story has stopped. Sometimes it simply means the next chapter deserves to be written more carefully.